All right, welcome everybody to another fun-filled hour of CE. We are going to talk for about the next 50 minutes or so about transitional health plans. Our more fun title to it is Grandmothers Going Away. So we're going to be talking about grandmothered health plans and what the future of them is going to be. So we'll start off by kind of doing the short version, and then we'll dive into a little bit more detailed version of these grandmothered health plans and what it means to be grandmothered and the timing for the expiration of these plans. But short version first. So we know that there was a original promise that President Obama made about people being able to keep their health insurance if they like their plan, and that led to a grandfathering provision. It was put into the Affordable Care Act. It was expanded on by the Department of Health and Human Services. Guidance for grandfathering, staying grandfathered, came out right around July 1st of 2010, about 3 months after the law was signed. It detailed the requirements for staying grandfathered and then talked about the different changes both in 2010 and 2014 that would be made to grandfathered plans and then to basically to non-grandfathered plans, and then changes that would be made to all plans. Later on, whenever the 2014 changes were set to kick in and people started getting notices that they were losing their health plans, there was a lot of confusion and fear and complaining in the marketplace, and so that led to an administrative fix in the form of transition relief that basically allowed people to keep their non-compliant but non-grandfathered plans for a period of time. So that promise, President Obama made that if you like your health plan, you can keep it. It was something he said when he was campaigning for president back in, in 2008. After he became president and he was lobbying for the healthcare law, he continued to say, if you like your health plan, you can keep it. And all of that was fine because, again, when the law was signed, there was a grandfathering provision in it. So it did actually provide rules for people who would like to keep their health plans. There was a way to do it if you met certain requirements. And then the Department of Health and Human Services issued the guidance related to grandfathering. The problem, though, was that even after President Obama, was successful in getting the Affordable Care Act passed, he continued to say, if you like your health plan, you can keep it. And, once people had made the decision about whether they wanted to stay grandfathered or not, that statement was no longer true. It really should have been amended to say, if you have a grandfathered plan, you can keep it. But people might, not have a grandfather plan, and those folks weren't able to keep their coverage. And so there was a bit of a misstatement, there by continuing to say the same thing that he always had. So, there was this issue, really even before the major changes that a grandfather plan could avoid were set to take effect. The issue is that most companies chose not to stay grandfathered. In fact, it looked like about only 25% or so of employees were covered by a grandfathered plan back in 2013, which was before the major changes were set to kick in, and it was even lower than that in some states. So a lot of companies weren't grandfathered, but they didn't realize it. And so they were a bit surprised when they received a termination letter from their carrier around the end of 2013. Same thing with individuals. So both individuals and employers, they might have chosen not to stay grandfathered, but then they continue to hear President Obama say, if you like your health plan, you can keep it. And so they sort of panicked and, freaked out, really, for lack of a better term, whenever they got those termination letters. So in November of 2013, the administration made a decision to allow individuals and small group carriers with the blessing of the state and individuals and small employers with the blessing of the state and the carriers continue their existing plan for a period of 1 year. CMS later revised that time frame. They did a 2-year extension of it. So they basically said that individuals and small groups, if the state allowed it, if the carriers allowed it, could renew through October 1st of 2016. And essentially what this transition relief did is it allowed existing plans to avoid a lot of the patient protections that are built into the law, including the essential benefits requirement and the modified adjusted community rating rules, which, those were put in place as a way to benefit certain people, but the effect is that for healthier people that were sort of winning under the old rating rules and who didn't feel that they needed all of those benefits to be covered by health insurance, they were hurt by the new rules. Their price was going to go up, so they wanted to avoid those new rating rules, and they were able to do that with this transition relief. Now, in the relief, it also said that groups of 51 or more employees that were going to be reclassified as small groups starting in 2004 or starting in 2016, that was the original plan, if you remember, they were going to have to wait until 2016 to take advantage of that relief. So basically, having a transitional plan was sort of like being grandfathered without being grandfathered. You got to avoid a lot of those Public Health Service Act requirements that that grandfather plans got to avoid. So the section relating to fair health insurance premiums, that's modified adjusted community rating, the guaranteed availability and renewability of coverage, the prohibition on pre-existing condition exclusions, the rule that says that they couldn't discriminate based on health status, the rule relating to comprehensive health insurance coverage, which is the essential benefits requirements, clinical trials, things like that. So there were a lot of different rules that were really left up to an employer whether they wanted to move into plans that applied those rules. Some of those new rules kicked in back in 2010. The majority of them kicked in 2014. So by staying grandfathered, you got to avoid a lot of those rules. For those groups that weren't grandfathered, certain provisions already applied to their plans back in 2010 when they chose not to stay grandfathered, but the bulk of them, that were set to kick in 2014, they would get to avoid by taking advantage of this transitional relief. So since it was like grandfathering without being grandfathered, these plans sort of got termed grandmothered plans. So what's funny is that when this grandmothering rule came out, it actually sort of nullified a strategy that we had been really working on back in 2013. If you'll recall, the new rules, the new rating rules, the essential health benefits and modified adjusted community rating rules, those were set to kick in on the group's renewal date in 2014. So if you had a January 1st renewal date, you were on the front lines, you were going to be the first, you were going to be among that first set of groups that started having to play by the new rules. If you had a later effective date in the year, then it was going to be a period of time before those rules kicked in for you. And so what carriers started advising their brokers to do is to advise their clients to move their effective date to December the 1st. So if you maybe previously had a January 1st effective date, you moved it to December 1st, then the new rules wouldn't kick in for you until December 1st of 2014, which is 11 months after that first set of groups that was going to have to play by the new rules. So it was really a case where procrastinating sort of paid off, right? If you had a later effective date, it was going to give you more time to avoid the new rules. Well, with the transition relief, because it said that you could renew your existing coverage through October of 2016, it meant that December 1st was no longer the best effective date to have. The best effective date to have would be October the 1st, as a renewal date. Second best would be September 1st and August 1st. So in other words, December 1st now was only the 10th out of 12 best effective dates, right? Or 11th, I guess, out of 12. So, it didn't make sense to have a December 1st effective date anymore. So what we started seeing is some of these groups that had moved to December 1st prior to the transition relief being passed or being issued, they started changing their effective date to October the 1st. So two changes, kind of very quickly, which was disruptive certainly for employers and for employees, but it looked like it was necessary here because of these rules. Well, after a couple of years of transition relief, as we were starting to approach the, that October 1st, 2016 magic date as the last time that you could renew your existing plan before you'd have to move into an ACA compliant plan, well, the government issued some more guidance. And this time what they said is basically, you know what, as long as you move into an ACA compliant plan by January of 2018, you're fine. You can continue with your existing transitional plan all the way till the end of 2017. So what that means is that all of that switching of effective dates, switching, 1st to December 1st, later switching to October 1st, all of that may have been unnecessary. Because of this last set of guidance, it looks like January 1st is actually the best effective date for a non-grandfathered group that wants to avoid the new rating rules. So really, this is just a case of musical chairs. I mean, they just kept they kept switching the effective dates, or I guess the end date for the transition relief for employers and individuals in the states that allowed it, and that meant that these employers and individuals had to respond accordingly. In general, it was employers that were jumping around, on their effective dates. So that's kind of the short version. We're going to take a little bit deeper dive here, though, and look at the actual guidance that came out and then talk about what it means for your clients. So in order to stay grandfathered, what Health and Human Services said is, if you like your plan, you can keep it, but you better really like it because you can't make really many changes at all to it. Number one, you can't raise your co-insurance charges at all. So in other words, if you had a 100% plan, let's say. In other words, a plan where you had a deductible and then everything was covered at 100% after the deductible, you could not switch that to a 90-10 plan or an 80-20 plan because that would be raising the co-insurance on the member. So you couldn't require people to pay more in co-insurance charges than they had previously. You could go the other way. You could go from 80 to 100%, which meant that for the member it would go from 20 to 0% cost sharing. But you couldn't go the other way, okay? Cannot significantly raise co-payment charges. What is significant? Well, it means 15% or more over the life of the policy. So starting on the day that the ACA was signed, March 23rd, 2010, you would not be able to raise your co-payments more than 15%. Means basically you couldn't raise your co-payments, right? I mean, people aren't going to go from a $20 to a $22 copayment or $23 copayment. That's kind of ridiculous. So it really made it difficult to adjust coinsurance or copayments. You cannot significantly raise deductibles. By significant, they mean, again, more than 15% over the life of the policy. So if you had a $1,000 deductible, you could go to $1,150, but you couldn't go to $1,200 because that would be considered a significant increase. Could not significantly lower employer contributions. Significant here would be more than 5%. So in other words, if the employer was previously paying 80% of the premium, they could drop down to 75. They could not drop below that. And then you could not add or tighten an annual limit on what the insurance company was paying. So you couldn't go to a more restrictive plan, essentially. So that's a lot of stuff. I mean, again, you really couldn't make any changes and still call it a grandfather plan. And so for that reason, way back in 2010, they did a study and they said that by 2013, they expected that 80% of companies with 99 or fewer employees would would need to or would end up losing their grandfather status. Kind of crazy, right? I mean, they knew all along that companies weren't going to hang on to their existing insurance. Now, depending on what side you are on, with this debate, some people could say, well, that was dishonest. They said if you like your health plan, you can keep it, but nobody really gets to keep it. Where the administration would have made the argument, and often did, well, yeah, you might have liked your existing plan, but you're going to like these plans too. There's a lot of good stuff in them, and so a lot of people aren't going to want to stay grandfathered. That was kind of their argument. Well, why did they say that? Why did they think that people were going to give up their grandfather status? Part of the reason was because back in 2010, whenever we had to make that first decision, remember, first effective date on or after September 23rd of 2010, groups had to decide whether they wanted to stay grandfathered or not. Same thing with individuals. So first renewal after that. Well, the thing is, there weren't that many provisions in the law back at that time that people got to avoid by staying grandfathered. You got to avoid the preventive care services requirement. In other words, that upfront preventive care covering, anything classified as B or above by the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. That was a pretty big list of preventive services, and those were not required to be put into grandfathered plans. Although, again, most plans already had some sort of preventive care, so this didn't make a huge difference in the premium. There were some things that really applied more to HMO plans, which there weren't a ton of HMO plans back in 2010. There's more now, but back in 2010 there weren't. And so at that time, what they said is that that you weren't required to get a referral to go see an OBGYN doctor. You didn't have to get prior approval for out-of-network emergency requirements, things like that. So it was stuff that more applied toward HMOs. And then they strengthened the internal and external appeals process. But again, there was already an appeals process with carriers. So this didn't really significantly add to the cost. So essentially, staying grandfathered didn't really save you much money in 2010, but it certainly made it more restrictive in that you couldn't shop and change plans every year like you might have done previously. The stuff that really did cost, more than just an insignificant amount back in 2010, those provisions the government thought were so important that all plans, even if they were grandfathered, needed to implement them. So getting rid of the lifetime limits on essential benefits, saying that you can't rescind coverage, except in cases of fraud. The coverage of young adults on their parents' health plan, the provision that said that pre-existing conditions for children age 19 and under had to be covered, with no exclusions. That sort of stuff had a bigger impact on price, but you couldn't avoid it. It was required of grandfathered and non-grandfathered plans. So back in 2010, a lot of groups said, well, it doesn't make any sense to stay grandfathered. So they lost their grandfathered status. Now you fast forward, you get to 2014. Does it make sense to be grandfathered at that point? Absolutely, because at that point, more of these changes that really had an impact on premium were kicking in. And so that meant things like the out-of-pocket limits, they're capped now at a certain amount. Actuarial value requirements, so that's the metallic levels, the 60, 70, 80, 90% bronze, silver, gold, and platinum levels of the health plans. The essential benefits, so new benefits that had to be covered on some of these plans, coverage of clinical trials, or at least saying that a carrier cannot cancel you because of participation in a clinical trial. Modified adjusted community rating, that's the big one, which said that there were 3-to-1 age bands. You couldn't rate based on medical conditions, couldn't rate based on gender anymore. So if a group had below average premiums back when the law was signed, right? Under the old rules, under the old rating rules, if they had below average premiums, it means it's because they were considered a better risk by the insurance company. So maybe it was a younger group, it was a healthier group, didn't have a lot of medical conditions, didn't have a lot of claims usage, right? So if a group benefited under the old rules, it means that when you put these new rules in place, the group's going to lose, right? Because they're going to see their costs go up simply because the benefits are better. They have more, benefits that are covered. They have a cap on out-of-pocket limits and so forth. But the primary reason was because of the modified adjusted community rating. So you won as an old group because you had a lot of young, healthy males in the group, but now you can't rate based on gender or medical anymore. You're going to see your prices go up, right? So grandfather groups got to keep playing by the old rules. That's the point of all of this. It made sense to be grandfathered in 2014 when the new rules kicked in, if the new rules were going to hurt you. Problem is, at that point, not a lot of plans were grandfathered, right? In fact, most groups, most individuals had lost their grandfathering status at that point. It's funny. There's a comment here, and he said that has this attendee says that has absolutely happened with a small group of mine. They've been grandfathered with their existing carrier since 2010. And their rates are about half of what my other groups are now. So yeah, I mean, if you had the foresight to stay grandfathered, thank you for that comment, and were successful at just renewing your plan again and again and again over time, might have meant that you had to pay some higher rates early on, but boy, those groups certainly are glad that they did it now, because it's allowed them to keep their premiums, if not stable, at least well below where they would have been if they had saved some money early on, but then moved into the new ACA compliant plans. So not a lot of plans were grandfathered at the time that these new rules were kicking in, and the problem is they didn't really realize it. And suddenly people started getting these letters from their insurance companies saying, hey, under the ACA, there's certain rules that kick in 2014. You don't have a grandfathered plan, so therefore you're going to have to play by the new rules. Your current plan isn't compliant, so we're going to cancel your current coverage and move you into one of these new ACA compliant plans starting at your next renewal date, right? And then I always joke about this. There was a NBC News piece that then got picked up by other news outlets. They broke the news that millions of people were going to lose coverage. So I always joke about it as it was 4-year-old breaking news, because they were just shocked by this story that we all knew about, right? I mean, as brokers, we had talked to our clients about it way back in 2010, but then we're already up to almost 2014, and everybody's panicking and saying, oh my gosh, the government's canceling, or carriers are canceling the coverage because of what the government's telling them to do, right? So there were all sorts of negative publicity about, President Obama. He knew that millions of people were going to lose their insurance. Of course he knew. We all knew. Remember, there was that study back in 2010 that said 80% of people would not be grandfathered by the time we got to just 2013. So yes, President Obama knew, but it wasn't a big cover-up. We talked to our clients about it at that time. But again, people don't pay attention. And so the media was, going nuts with these stories, but then Congress freaked out as well. If you remember, this was October of 2013. That's when this story was breaking, right? And something else big was happening in October of 2013. That's when healthcare.gov went live. And it was to quote President Trump, it was a disaster, right? I think 6 people were enrolled nationwide the first day. So it was a huge mess. So they bring Kathleen Sebelius in front of Congress to testify about healthcare.gov, and our elected officials spent the vast majority of their time not talking about healthcare.gov, but rather talking about President Obama lying to the American people and saying if you like your health plan, you can keep it, but now all these plans are being canceled. The truth is, we knew the rules. They didn't pay attention. They freaked out whenever they did learn the rules. So all of this led to rapidly declining poll numbers. I mean, it really did hurt President Obama and the administration in the polls. And so finally you said, okay, fine. You know what? Everybody, y'all can hang on to your existing plans if you want, even if they're not grandfathered. So this transition relief guidance came out in November of 2013, and it essentially said, we're going to give you another year, right? We're going to give you one more year to hang on to your existing health plan. And then they followed up with some guidance in early March of 2014, and it had to do with extended transition relief. So essentially what they're going to say here is, hey, way back in November, we told you that you could hang on to your existing plan for another year. We're going to go even beyond that. So they start off by saying, that, groups that take advantage of this relief, they're not going to be considered out of compliance with the market reforms. Essentially, a group could renew between January 1st, 2014 and October 1st, 2014 with their existing coverage. So it would give them a one-year extension, right? Well, then they go on to explain the same stuff we've already said. It's sort of like being grandfathered without being grandfathered. You get to avoid a lot of the consumer protections that are built into the Affordable Care Act. But then they go on to say that, hey, we're actually going to extend this for 2 years. We're going to give you not until October 1st of 2014, but rather until October 1st of 2016 to renew your existing coverage. And then there's a sentence here, and I'm going to bring this up again later 2 more times, I believe. It says, we will consider the impact of the 2-year extension of the transitional policy in assessing whether an additional 1-year extension is appropriate. So just keep that in mind. They also say that it applies to large groups that will soon be small groups, because back at the time, if you remember, groups were set to be redefined as small group. If they had 51 to 100 employees, they were going to be redefined as small groups starting in 2016. And so what they said is, hey, in 2016, those employers will be able to take advantage of this same transition relief. So they'll be able to, at that point, because they'll be a small group, they'll be able to renew their existing non-ACA compliant plan for a period of time, right? Turns out, though, the small group definition didn't change. The PACE Act ended up being passed back in 2014, I believe. Could have been 2015, but basically what it said is that states have the option of retaining their current definition of small group or changing it to include groups of 100 employees or more. The default would be to just stay at the current definition of in most states up to 50. In the state of Texas, they certainly made that decision. So we retain the current definition of 2 to 50 as a small group, which means that groups of 51 to 100 employees, they never are going to enter the small group market. They're never going to be subject to modified adjusted community rating. And so that statement is no longer applicable because of the PACE Act. So that whole part of the guidance relating to groups of 51 to 100, you can essentially ignore. But if a group already had a small group plan, then they would be able to stay as a small group and continue to play by the small group rules, which means they would be able to take advantage of the transition relief. The rest of this guidance, it says that states and carriers can pick and choose which market segments they want to apply the transition relief to. They could do it to both individual and small group, individual only, small group only, or both. There is a new notice requirement. Health insurance issuers that renew coverage under the transitional policy must each policy year provide the relevant attached notice. So there was a notice attached to that guidance. to the affected individuals and small businesses. And then there was a hardship exemption for anybody who was not offered a transitional plan and was having their policies canceled. They would be able to buy a catastrophic plan even if they were over the age of 30. So that was the guidance from March of 2014. Then there was a frequently asked questions document that was issued in May. Didn't really go into a lot more detail. It starts off by kind of reviewing the rules, saying that individual and small group carriers that renew this non-compliant coverage, they're not considered to be avoiding or failing to comply with the market reform. So in the same way that the first set of guidance said the small employers that take advantage of the relief, they're not breaking the rules. Here it says the carriers that offer the relief, they're also not breaking the rules. Question about the 51 to 100, and talking about ones that are large group policyholders, saying they have to wait till 2016. Again, that really no longer applies because of the PACE Act. Another rule related to that size group, it does say that if an individual or a small employer had switched carriers, then the states and the carriers can decide whether or not to allow them to take advantage of the transitional plan option. It does say that the old plans cannot be reinstated. There was a weird rule when it was going to apply to groups of 51 or more. It said that they could take advantage of the transition relief even if they didn't have coverage at the time the transition relief was passed. Again, no longer applicable. These transitional policies are considered to be minimum essential coverage for purposes of the individual mandate. So to kind of sum it all up, basically if the states and the carriers agree, then these small employers and or individuals could renew their current non-compliant plan. So it's just like being grandfathered without being grandfathered. They would have the same benefits and rating rules in the past as in the past. Unhealthy groups probably wouldn't want to take advantage of this because they benefit from the new modified adjusted community rating rule. So those groups should have already been in ACA compliant plans. Healthy groups may have a higher renewal because the carriers still need to offset the cost of the unhealthy groups who aren't paying as much now. So that's not anything that's in the guidance. That's just an observation. We had the attendee here comment just a moment ago about the fact that he's got clients, or one client that is grandfathered, that is paying less than or about half the amount of some of the ACA compliant plans. Same thing with the transition relief. If you've got a grandmothered plan, they're likely paying less than the ACA compliant plans, but they're still possibly paying more than they would have if the ACA was never passed and they just continue with their existing coverage. And the reason is you've got the ACA plans where carriers are losing money because you've got the bad risks there that are taking advantage of it. And if the carrier is losing money on that population, it certainly makes sense that they would raise the prices at least some on these transition relief plans. So yes, you avoid the new rules. It doesn't mean that you're not feeling the impact at all of the of the ACA and the new rating rules. So then there was a final piece of guidance here in February of 2016. And what it says is, well, we told you way back in 2014, we told you that we were going to consider the impact of the 2-year extension of the transitional policy in assessing whether an additional 1-year extension is appropriate. And we've assessed and we've decided it is appropriate. Not a full 1-year extension, but essentially what they said is, as long as a plan ends by December 31st, 2017, then they don't have to become ACA compliant until January 1st of 2018. So, depending on what your effective date was, this could have certainly been a extension of the time. So if somebody, for instance, had a January 1st renewal date, they would have moved into an ACA compliant plan January 1st of 2016, right? No, January 1st of 2017. If you had a December 1st renewal date, then December 1st of 2017 is when you would have had to move into the ACA compliant. I might be messing this up. No, December 1st of 2016, I guess. So what essentially happened here is with this relief, those groups that didn't have the optimal renewal date of October the 1st, they essentially had the option of moving their effective date once again potentially and extending the transition relief just a little bit longer. So they basically are allowing all groups to renew by January 1st of 2018 into the ACA compliant plans, but prior to that, you don't have to be ACA compliant. So has anybody responded based on this? It's hard to say. I certainly haven't heard nearly as much about the moving of effective dates for this set of guidance as I did in the past. You know, remember before the guidance, everybody was moving to December 1st. After the guidance, a lot of groups moved to October 1st. Now the best renewal date to have is January 1st, but I don't know. I haven't really seen a lot of groups moving. They do suggest here in this guidance from CMS that a carrier might allow an employer either to renew early or to go with a short plan year. So, you know, to take advantage of this. So I'll just ask the question out there. After this set of guidance, for those here that are on the call, did you have any small group clients that moved their effective date, you know, to maybe to a January 1st so that they could avoid the rules just a little bit longer? So just simple a yes or no. Did anybody here change the effective dates on any of their clients based on this? And this will serve as your attendance check. So as long as you answer me, I know you're still here. If you don't have an opinion on it, you can put not applicable or whatever, but everybody needs to chime in. Oh, interesting. So so far from everybody, what I've seen is no, that people didn't make the change. So maybe brokers were a little bit tired of switching their clients' effective dates. Maybe the clients were tired of it, but it doesn't seem to have happened nearly as much, even though the same logic applies. So long story short, you know, we had an initial one-year transition relief that was expanded to 3 years. Then it was expanded a little bit more. By that second extension, it was expanded, you know, to the end of 2017 potentially, but not beyond that. So what that means is by the end of the year, you're going to need to kiss your grandmother plans goodbye, right? Or is that what that means? You know, your clients may not need to do this because we might be looking potentially at a third extension of this transition relief. So remember, you had the initial transition relief issued in November of 2013. It was extended in March of 2014. It was extended again in February of 2016. And the reason that I say that you might be looking at another extension is this. There's really 3 arguments for it. One is that President Trump did sign an executive order instructing the various government agencies and departments to ease the financial burden of Obamacare, right? Well, complying with the ACA laws, you know, the essential benefits requirement, the modified adjusted community rating rules, that certainly is a financial burden of Obamacare for smaller, healthier groups. In other words, those that are grandmothered right now, those that are taking advantage of the transition relief. So an easy way to ease the burden would be don't make them play by the new rules. The second reason that I say this is because it is possible that the ACA will be repealed and that there will be a replacement plan passed before the expiration of the transitional plans. So we're hearing that, right now Congress is out there visiting their district offices, so they're on a recess in D.C. But we're hearing, from Paul Ryan that in the weeks following the recess that they're going to be unveiling the replacement plan. Another congressman said that they're going to be doing markup the first week of March on the bill. So a bill is going to be introduced soon. Now, whether it will pass, whether it'll pass in its entirety, whatever remains to be seen, but it's certainly possible because we do know now at this point that Republicans are moving forward with this. They are going to have a bill sooner rather than later. So if it passes, then basically we're going to know what's going to happen, but it probably won't have happened by the time these transitional plans are expiring. So in other words, it's going to take a little while to implement. The same way the ACA took a while to implement, this will take a while to implement as well. And so postponing the date once again could help those groups avoid the new rules altogether. And so it just seems like a logical thing to do. I mean, if you knew that the new rules were going to kick in, whatever new rules that the government comes up with, let's say that they were going to kick in January of 2019, wouldn't it make sense to just extend the transition relief one more year so you don't have to deal with the mess of these groups facing the big rate increase for 1 year, potentially having to drop coverage and then maybe sign up again in 2019? It seems like an easily avoidable hassle, right? So if they can avoid the hassle of all of that, why not do it? And then the third reason that I say that they might postpone, push that date back once again is because we've already heard them say that they might, right? And that initial 2014 guidance, written at the end of February, published and sent out at the end of early March, it said, we will consider the impact of the 2-year extension of the transitional policy in assessing whether an additional 1-year extension is appropriate. They didn't give an additional 1-year extension. They gave an additional 2-month extension with their guidance last year. And so certainly they talked about the possibility before. They've been instructed by the president to ease the burden. It's an easy way for CMS to do that. So who knows? Maybe grandmothered plans won't be going away. We'll see. But what if it does end? What if the transition relief does end? What are the alternatives? Well, one would be just move into an ACA compliant plan, right? That basically means that groups would have to cover all essential benefits. So the small employers are going to be subject to the essential benefits requirement. And then second, they're going to be subject to the modified adjusted community rating rule. So younger, healthier groups will suffer. They will pay more. As a result, they will experience that rate shock that we've heard about. They could drop the coverage, right? Most groups with transitional plans have fewer than 50 full-time equivalents, so they're not subject to the employer mandate. They're not required to offer coverage. And if the rates go up too much, they certainly might drop their plans and wait and see if something better comes up, later on down the road, but they certainly could decide to go without coverage for a year. Third thing they could do is buy a self-funded plan. Even if the group has fewer than 51 employees, self-funded plans, they're not part of the small group market. So that means that they play by a different set of rules. The essential benefits, modified adjusted community rating rules, those apply to the small group market. So if you're not in a market, you get to avoid those rules. There's no requirement for self-funded plans to cover any essential benefits other than preventive care. Preventive care is separate. It's a requirement under Public Health Service Act Section 2713. So preventive care has to be covered, but all the other essential benefits, those are kind of optional. They don't have to cover them. They just can't have an annual or lifetime dollar limit on any that they do cover. And self-funded plans are not subject to modified adjusted community rating. So that means they can still rate based on medical conditions. They can decline altogether. They can use age bands that are greater than 3-to-1. They can rate based on gender, right? So they can pretty much play by the old rules, which means that younger, healthier groups benefit from being self-funded it's sort of like being grandfathered or being grandmothered or being a large group. They can benefit from the favorable underwriting. The other option, I think, for your customers, it's something that I don't normally recommend, but they could just take the wait and see approach, because there is a strong possibility of repeal. So it may actually be the best advice you can give to your clients. In other words, instead of rushing right now to figure out what to do, they don't need to start making plans to drop their coverage. They don't need to move into a self-funded plan right away. If they've got a renewal date that's later in the year, they can just wait and see what happens. And those options are still going to be available to them if the ACA is repealed, but the the transition relief is ending, and the old rules, or I'm sorry, the newer ACA rules are still going to apply for a period of time, as they're implementing the new law. Fine, they can certainly take advantage of some of those options we just discussed, but they don't have to make that decision right now. But I think it is also a fair question to ask, what happens after the ACA is repealed? What happens to transition relief? In other words, if the ACA is repealed, but it takes a little bit of time, is transition relief, is it still going to apply or what? Well, again, during a phase-in of the new law, yes, I think transition relief could apply. At whatever point, though, the new law does go into effect, then I think transition relief goes away and the new rules are going to apply. What might those new rules be? Well, I think it starts with realizing that the new rules are basically the old rules unless they put something else in their place. If the ACA is repealed, then it means the essential benefits requirement goes away, so you don't have to cover all those same benefits, so you go back to state mandates, right? The caps on the out-of-pocket limits, and unless they leave them in, those go away. The 3-to-1 age rating goes away, probably will be replaced by 5-to-1 age bands. The metallic levels could potentially go away, for at least on the group side. The prohibition on medical and gender underwriting would go away. In other words, in the absence of something else, we basically go back to what the rules used to be. So what would they put in place of the ACA or the old rules that would be the default now? Well, I actually think they're probably going to push it to the states, right? So the federal government, they're more concerned with stabilizing the individual marketplace. And so I think the GOP is probably going to push the decision about the group market back to the states and let them decide what to do. That's the way it worked previously. There was a federal HIPAA law that became the basis of the small group laws here in the state of Texas, and certainly in other states as well, but then the state could expand on that. So, for instance, part of the HIPAA law said that a carrier in the small group market couldn't decline a small group, but they could rate up. But the rate up amount was different in different states. Some states it was 10%. Other states it was 100%. State of Texas, where I am, it was 67% roughly. So we might go back to the old rules, but if we do, well, now we're looking at rate shock the other way, right? You've got groups that are in ACA compliant plans that are currently playing by the new rules that don't allow medical underwriting, that have the 3-to-1 age rating, that don't allow gender underwriting. If it's a group that is benefiting from the new ACA rules and you take away the ACA rules, you go back to the old rules that we had in the various states, well, suddenly the price of those groups might go up significantly. And I think, we might have to do something to reduce the rate shock the other way. So maybe we go to a modified version of what the old state rules were. So maybe instead of a 67% rate increase, rate up, maybe they would allow 30 or 40%. At this point, we don't know, but it is certainly something that the states are going to have to deal with if the federal government doesn't. If the federal government pushes it to the states to figure out what to do on the group side, then states are going to have to make some pretty quick decisions. And certainly some sort of transition relief might be appropriate. Either an extension of the current grandmother plans or a different type of transition relief may be appropriate as a result. So we have about 2 minutes left. If anybody has any questions or comments, please feel free to chime in now. You can also email me. My email address is eric@comedyce.com. So certainly feel free to email me if you have any thoughts on this or any questions about the transition relief, and I'll be happy to share my thoughts with you. So give it just a second here, see if anybody asks anything. All right. Well, I don't see any questions. I'll stay on the line for another minute or so, but if you don't have any, then you're certainly free to go. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you on another upcoming webinar. Have a great day.